Hello there, it's Phumlani Majosi, the author of a new book, Lessons from Past Heroes. I am in England this week. I'm in London. So it's been awesome to be here and to meet smart, intelligent people, talk politics, the economics, get to hear what people think on global affairs. So I've really had an awesome time here and got to, I've been also getting my book, Lessons from Past Heroes, bought, and I've been signing copies. I'm sure some of you who follow me on social media have been seeing my posts. So please, you also get your copy this festive season. The book is about the importance of the free market economy, of personal responsibility, of family, how we can move South Africa forward. Why is it important to have a mindset of saying, look, we are the masters of our destiny. We need to remove the nanny state and do things ourselves and push for stronger business in the country. So please do get your copy. You can get the copy for yourself or for your aunt, for your mom, for your cousin. It would make a great read this festive season, and I would appreciate your support. So then I've just told you I've been meeting smart people, and I'm with Dr. Stephen Brien here. He and I have met before. He once invited me to a very nice, gathering in Nairobi a few years back. I think it was 22, if I'm not mistaken, where we were there and we are discussing, with other guys who are active like me in acting public affairs, guys across Africa who were gathered in Nairobi to think about Africa and how do we make it flourish in a hyper competitive world. So Dr. Stephen Brien is here with me today, and he and I are going to talk about Africa. He is a senior fellow at the Future Africa Forum. He is an author as well. He has advised African governments. So he is the man to talk to understand what is going on in Africa. Dr. Brien, awesome to see you, sir. How are you
Great to
doing?
see you too. Oh, good, thanks.
Fantastic, fantastic. Dr. Brien, you have been, you watch South Africa and Africa, the whole continent. We're an Africa expert. South Africa has had this very interesting, election this past May, an election that saw the African National Congress, the liberator of Black people in South Africa, a country that led South Africa from their part, away from the apartheid system, transitioned into democracy. It lost power for the first time in 30 years. It lost its majority, basically, and now has been forced to govern in a coalition. What do you make of this, Dr. Brien? What are your thoughts on this government of national unity in South Africa? This outcome we saw this year, what does it mean for South Africa?
Look, I'm very hopeful of this government. I say I'm using the word advisedly. I mean, it's not just simply optimism, blind optimism, but there's hope. And I think the reason for that is this is not South Africa's first government national unity. I mean, if we dial back 30 so years, the transition from apartheid to self-governance was bridged with a government of national unity. And I think that government helped a lot to, in effect, bring the ANC in to detoxify some of the challenges. And I think there's an analog now. There's another transition. As you mentioned, it's the first time the ANC has lost its majority. And on one level, just like we've seen in Botswana, where for the first time in 50, 60 years, we've seen a transition of power, a mature South Africa will need to go through repeated transitions of power. No one party, no one group is entitled to have a permanent majority. And I think as the GNU in the 90s was a bridge, this GNU is also a bridge to a more pluralist form of democracy. I mean, we see we've got four big parties in the country now. There are different combinations that could, in theory, achieve power. I think of the various combinations that were possible, I think we've got the best pairing. If we have to put two together, you've got the ANC that has a long history of governance, Democratic Alliance, again, particularly in the Cape, has a track record of governing. So these are two mature political organizations. that you are going to have to demonstrate to the rest of the country what, in France has typically been called cohabitation, cohabitation, where two different political parties have to work together for the good of the country. And they are going to succeed politically at the next election by demonstrating that they were good partners. And I think that's the really, really positive part of this. And also by working together, by breaking bread together, by having to collaborate and cooperate, it's going to be very difficult for them in the next election to sort of throw stones at each other and call each other, you know, challenging, insulting names, because the public will say, well, look, you guys were in government. Now, the risk is, of course, that at some point this arrangement may break down in acrimony. And I think that will be the sort of sad outcome. I think it'd be much better for the government to work its way through to a natural point, go to the polls and run on their track record. And then people can determine, did the ANC basically renew itself, and did it warrant another term? Did the DA demonstrate it was capable of governing? Does it deserve more power? Or, MKEFF, have they got an argument to say that pair didn't do it well, bring us in instead? So I think we're on the route to a better dialogue, a better political debate, I hope.
Mm-hmm. So now, Dr. Brien, suppose now you were to meet John Steenhuisen, right, the leader of the Democratic Alliance, and our Cyril Ramaphosa, right? These are two major partners in this government of national unity. Of course, there are smaller parties like IFP, Patriotic Alliance, Freedom Front Plus as well is there. But if you were to meet John Steenhuisen, right, and Cyril Ramaphosa, our president, and you sit with them down, you sit with them in a room and you advise them, what would you say should be their focus in the country over the next years as they are governing in a coalition? What would they have to focus on to uplift South Africa?
I think they first of all have to agree that it is the well-being of the sort of ordinary South African is their critical aim, and they have to sort of jointly agree that. I don't think there's huge disagreement there, but I think a positive articulation of that's what we're all fighting for. We actually have a pretty common goal. We have different views about the best way of getting there, and we're going to have to compromise on it. But the ordinary South African is going to work every day, who's bringing up their family. That is the iconic group that we need to support and help thrive. We're not there just to feather the nests of the elites. We're not there to harken back to an old day of different values. We're there to move forward, and it is that sort of median household. Somebody who may be commuting a few hours to work and back. How do we make that better? Who may have precarious employment. How do we make that better? And then there are issues around property rights, business regulation that I think, we would need to be saying as a pair. I'm sort of putting myself in their voice at the moment. We will work through and we'll come to good compromises. And we know that neither of us have a mandate to impose our views. But the one thing we're not going to do is we're not going to end up, and I think this is where they need to politically commit. We can look north to what happened in Zimbabwe with Morgan Tsvangirai, and we say, look, we are not going to go down that road. And we need to tell our supporters, we will have to make compromises. We will disappoint our supporters, but we're doing it for the national good, because it's better to have political cohesion, to have some stability, and then to give the voters a genuine chance to refresh and review our performance at the next election at the appropriate time, rather than bringing it forward because we've got to fight.
We've got to fight. Yeah. Now let's move to the rest of the African continent. You have done a lot of work there. You advise governments, as I did introduce to the audience. When you look at Africa, people tend to say, at least this is my view, Dr. Brien. People in some parts of the world, they think that Africa is just one region of one people who think the same way, who are the same. And in my view, look, we have East Africa. There is a different people facing their challenges. We have Central Africa, we have West Africa, we have Southern Africa. I'll speak about more in sub-Saharan Africa. So these are different countries. Don't see them as one. and think about them. Don't say there's Africa and then you forget that these are different countries that to an extent have different challenges. But in your view overall, what are the economic challenges that Africa faces at this point?
Yeah, yeah. Look, first of all, I absolutely agree with you. This is a, very large continent, very varied terrain, geography, peoples, tribes, traditions, languages, cultures, and that all plays into both the politics and the economics of the situation. But that said, as an outsider looking in, there are common patterns across much of Africa. And I'll say much of Africa rather than all of Africa.
Yeah.
I think, from an economic point of view, the first observed factor is very low levels of industrialization and sort of value add within nearly all African economies. South Africa, obviously quite different in the south, and you get up to sort of Morocco in the north, and they would be saying they are the outliers. But many countries in between, as it were, are poorly industrialized. And the industrialized transition is one of the key routes to development. On top of that, particularly given the demographic shifts, there's very high levels of unemployment, and there has been the persistent poverty that has come from that. I think one of the reasons that this is happening, again, on a very sort of tangible basis, is weak infrastructure, a long legacy of poor infrastructure, because that is something that takes generations to build up. And it's very hard overnight to suddenly get good infrastructure. But without the politics being right, without the financing being right, it's very hard to develop that. So I think that's sort of, if you think about a 20, 30, 40-year trajectory, infrastructure is probably the big thing that needs to be worked on. But these are just the manifestations. I think that the real challenges are a combination of a legacy of poor economic policies, and particularly, post the independence period in the 60s, liberation movements dominating a lot of the politics and economic thinking of Africa meant that you had bouts of socialism, you had macroeconomic instability through the 70s and 80s, which really held a lot of countries in Africa back. So even though there's better quality governance today, even though there are more willing partners for finance, there's a legacy that needs to be worked through. But I'd say still there is a political will issue, is what the former chief economist of GIFIT, Stefan Durkheim, describes as that elite bargain for growth. Is it there? Do you have a situation whereby the elites in the country are keen to progress the country's overall economy and willing to, at one level, sacrifice their vested interests in the short term for economic growth for everybody, including them, in the long term? And that political bargain, when it occurs, as we historically have seen in, say, Mauritius or Botswana, more recently in Rwanda, is the critical key to unlocking the decision making. It's not that there are not a lot of good ideas about how to transform the economies of many African countries, but it is often the political will to do it that is at heart what makes it difficult to have that transformation.
It's very interesting. You speak of Mauritius, Botswana. I think you spoke about Rwanda as well. Um, Tell me about our neighbor, just the people we share the border with, Botswana. What can other African countries learn on policy reform, on governance? Because I mean, I've read about Botswana before, Dr. Brien, and it's always been held up as a country that got economic reform right over the past few decades of post-colonial rule across Africa, and they've gotten policy right. Tell me, what can we learn from Botswana?
So good governance
Mm,
requires a lot of things to go right. And it's not just about the sort of the politics and the electoral system. It's about capability and competence in government. I think, I'll start there. One of the things that Botswana did, and I'll contrast that, say, with another neighbor further north, Zambia.
mm,
At independence, Botswana, and the Seretse Khama, needs to be credited with this, said, we will keep on a lot of the administrators from the colonial times because they are experienced. We will keep on the judges. We will keep on some of the senior officials, the permanent secretaries, and so forth. So what happened is at the very, very beginning of Botswana's independence, it had A, stability, but B, there was a compact between those officials who stayed behind and did not go back home, as it were, to Britain, and the Botswanan government of saying, look, we want you to stay here to help us build a good system.
Mm.
Whereas in Zambia, north of Botswana, and in many other countries, that legacy group were, sent back to Britain. And you can understand that this is not meant as a criticism of those that like we want to do it our own way. I think Seretse Khama was very savvy in recognizing that there's a learning curve. So that was one thing. I think the other was he also made use of the existing governance institutions, the traditional kotla, for example. He brought the chieftains into the upper house. So again, it was a transition. It was an incremental change. He made sure that in effect he tied the chief's political interest and the nation's development together. Whereas in many other countries, the traditional leaders ended up being in tension with the new states, whereas Khama brought them in. So that meant you had stability, you had experience. And then on top of that, he made sure that the diamonds were considered a national resource rather than owned by any particular tribe that happened to have the diamonds in their area. And recognized that if he wanted to get De Beers in to help, he had to create a set of structures and systems that gave trust, and they were trustworthy. And as a result of that, because he needed somebody like De Beers to come in and mine the diamonds, he had to create systems of property rights. He had to create systems of commercial law so that De Beers was happy. But as a result, everybody in Botswana benefited from what he had to do to get the diamond deal going. So at one level, it's not that it was luck, but there were huge collateral benefits from the Botswanan government doing what it needed to do to secure the potential of the diamonds. And as a result, Botswana has managed to flourish. Now, on the other hand, there is a sort of soft underbelly to this question, which is as a country like Botswana has good diamond reserves, is able to use that for building infrastructure, schools, roads, hospitals, kickstarting the economy. The reliance on the diamonds has also meant that Botswana hasn't had to really push hard on entrepreneurship, innovation, etc. And I think it's now going through a phase of saying, okay, what's next? What's the post-diamond future? And at one level, it runs the risk now of being leapfrogged by other countries who are more ambitious, who are generating more R&D, more innovation, more entrepreneurship. Now, while, say, Rwanda is still from a per capita GDP well behind Botswana, its trajectory, its energy, its drive is something that many people in Botswana look to and say, how do we create that so that we don't end up becoming more like a low performing European state with a large welfare state and people expect the government to provide. So I think there's a little tension here as you get more successful, you've got to make sure that at one level this economic hunger is maintained. And that I'd say is one of the challenges for the new Botswana government to reignite that fire.
It's fascinating. At least, look, we do have a few examples in Africa we can point to and say, we can replicate that. Other countries in Africa can replicate that. As we've just said, Botswana is just one example. There's also Mauritius as well. So it's not like it's really hopeless in Africa. There are a few countries we can learn from, right?
Yeah.
Mm.
And so let me take that a step further, which is a piece of work I did a couple of years ago, looking across all the different dimensions of prosperity in the world, and said, if we take everything from quality of roads, education, health, business regulation, electoral democracy, civil liberties, etc., and if we take the top 5 countries on each of these dimensions in Africa, what would it look like? And actually, you'd be a Portugal. So the key thing here is to say that the success, and on nearly all the different things you need to think about, there are half a dozen at least, if not more, highly successful stories in Africa across each of these dimensions. So every single one of them can be done. The challenge is combining them all together. But
Okay.
what I think is really important to think about is it's not that there's a number of dimensions where African countries are unable to succeed. African countries have demonstrated across the piece an ability to succeed on all these dimensions. Now it's the combination that we need to find a way of bringing together.
Hmm. And political will as well, Dr. Brien.
But that's, I mean, the political will is what's going to help with
Yeah.
with that combination. You can have an authoritarian government, you can have a clientelist government that is willing to get one or two things right because that's in the interest of the elites, and those one or two things could vary across different countries, but it's hard to get all of them right, and that's what political will does for you.
Yes, yeah, yeah. I'm speaking to Dr. Stephen Brien. He is a senior fellow at the Future Africa Forum and author. He has advised African governments over the years. I'm in London this week, so I have been meeting wonderful people, and I'm also trying to set up my book event for next year here in London. Hopefully, that can work out, and we can have a nice book event here. Dr. Brien, and then there is this debate about, I've heard it a lot, and I'd love to hear your views here. Um, that is, we have some elements within the African political context and also in other parts of the world who say that, well, Africa is where it is with all these challenges it faces, still the poorest continent, in the world. We should blame colonialism. Colonialism was huge. It's something to blame. This is the legacy of colonialism. How do you respond to that? Does that have any, is it solid, decades after independence in Africa? Can we blame colonialism for Africa's economic misfortune at this point?
No, I think there are two sub questions in what you've said.
Mm,
One is, yeah, does colonialism have an impact? And the second, should we blame colonialism? And let me address the second first of all, because I think the first one is a much more interesting question.
mm,
I don't think there's huge value in backward-looking blame, because at one level there is no more any colonialism. So that what actions can the ex-colonial countries do to address Africa going forward? They are best thought about in an effort of collaboration and cooperation rather than a blame game. So if African countries want to engage Europeans in particular uh, on their development, that is a great conversation to have. Um, but I would say, politically speaking, do it in a spirit of, please engage with us and support us rather than blame. Now, let's think about the impact because that side is very real. And I'll give you a sort of longer term historic analogy, which is the Roman Empire. The contours, again, another colonial system, albeit, 1,000, 2,000 years beforehand.
mm,
The contours of the Roman Empire can still be seen in Europe's economy. So there's no doubt that history casts a long shadow. The Roman trading routes, where Romans had towns, the extent to which the Romans had extensive military fortifications, etc., all can be seen, can literally be seen in Europe today.
mm,
Um, so that says, that is an example. I'm sort of deliberately taking it out of, say, any of the sort of perspective of blame and attribution in Africa, but say, look, colonialism, uh, just like many other historic aspects, does cast a long shadow. So, is Africa, impacted by colonialism? Yes. Was Africa the only place impacted by colonialism? No. Nearly every part of the world at some point has experienced colonialism.
absolutely. That is very true. Yeah. Mm,
Um, but that said, I think what we can look at in the African context is have countries who experience similar levels of colonialism progress similarly? Have they been equally held back? And I think that's where you start to shift to a view about agency and the choices individual governments have made. And I think while the impact of colonialism is there, it is receding into the background because of the impact of other choices that have been made in the last 60 years are actually dominating the situation. So, you know, should people in the DRC blame colonialism or should they blame Laurent Kabila for their situation? I'm not into the blaming, but at this point, the impact of Kabila and his politics, and indeed the role of the CIA, is probably far more impactful than King Leopold at this stage. If we think about Zambia, Kenneth Kaunda and the way, which particularly the late 60s, early 70s, he had a sort of volte-face in terms of his economic and political stance. That's had a bigger impact on Zambia than how the British ran the Copper Belt 100 years ago. They both have impact. But actually, I think looking forward, learning lessons from the choices that were made both politically and economically over the last 50 years is a far more helpful and constructive approach than necessarily learning too many lessons from colonialism of 100 and 150 years ago.
Yeah, 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 yeah. That is, I mean, that's very powerful what you are saying. I couldn't agree more. I, we have to we have to work toward the future. This is how I say it. Let's work toward putting reforms that we need to uplift Africa. Well, as you say, is there any population group that was not at some point colonized? Is there any country?
Well,
It's hard
I
to
think,
find. Yeah.
yeah, it's hard to. I mean, in the African context, Ethiopia is often held up as one of those countries that pretty well stayed independent nearly all the time. I mean, the Italians sort of came and went, but they never really found themselves under the grip of a foreign power in the way that nearly all other African countries have.
Mm,
Um, but if you think about it, that didn't mean that Ethiopia didn't go through some pretty difficult times, in the 70s and 80s following the overthrow of Haile Selassie. So again, Ethiopia's history, is driven hugely by the conflicts, the Marxism of that period than it was whether or not the Italians, managed to get a grip of the country, in the 30s and 40s, or more than
mm,
30s.
mm, mm. And also maybe just on that point, I just want to get your quick thoughts here. Could one argue that whether you were being colonized or not colonized does have impact on your current economic standing, right? In other words, would we expect that, well, Ethiopia was not colonized and therefore can expect it to be doing much better economically in terms of living standards, in terms of GDP per capita, growth, institutions, um, and those that were colonized, they should be doing worse. Because it seems like to me, you can have a country like South Africa that was once colonized and sort of does better in contrast to a country like Ethiopia in terms of institutions, in terms of stability, in terms of economic productivity and all that. So is really colonialism that determinant that really shapes as to whether you could be rich or poor in a way?
So
Extent, yeah.
there's a bit more to it than that. And
Yeah.
Darren Acemoglu and his colleagues, who this year won the Nobel Prize in Economics, um, looked into this several years ago. Their thesis was quite an interesting one. Was actually it's the nature of the colonialism that you really have to think about.
The nature.
In
Okay.
um, in some countries where the white colonialists sort of suffered a lot from disease and were in effect found it very difficult to settle, they ended up creating what Acemoglu and colleagues call extractive institutions. So rather than farming the land, creating a system of courts, etc., they sort of delegated the business of extracting rubber or mines, whatever, to local chieftains, and in effect, it was a form of tribute, and therefore you had all the negative consequences of slavery, servitude, extraction, and no institution building. And it's those countries that they argue suffered much more and have had a much more difficult time afterwards than the countries where the settlers were able through the fact that they could survive, settled and brought institutions, such as the rule of law, such as property rights, such as commercial law, because actually you had and this is sort of South Africa would be a good example of this. You had a larger settler community who, in effect, transported many of the structures, institutions that they had been used to in their home country into the new territories. And
Mm.
as a result, those countries had a bit of a head start because there was more of a tradition of these type of economic institutions. So that for Asmund and Robinson Co. is the big divide. It's actually the type of settler structures, which they hypothesized was actually driven by, for example, the presence of malaria or not, as opposed to anything else.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's very powerful.
But
We have
on that,
five minutes. Yeah,
but
yes,
can I
please.
just give you the interesting counterexample back to Zambia and Botswana? That at one level is a counterexample to that thesis because Botswana, uh, was never really settled. There was a mild extractive system going on,
Mm,
but it wasn't settled. Whereas in Zambia, again, the copper belt was well settled. There were many more sort of political and economic institutions in Zambia as a result of the greater British presence there was in Botswana. And yet, Botswana has shown that it's perfectly possible to bootstrap from a starting point that's much more indigenous.
yeah, yeah. Fascinating, fascinating. Now, we have 4 minutes left. Quickly here, Dr. Brien. The rise of China, Africa within this global context we are seeing. There is now this sort of there are global tensions between the US and China, there's Russia, and all these conflicts that are going on. And this, some have argued that we are entering what they call Cold War II. How should Africa position itself quickly as Africans? How should we position ourselves in this environment?
I think what I'm seeing so far is the countries that are working well with Africa um, are those that um, treat Africa, sorry, with China, sorry, those that treat China as a partner rather than, an aid giver, where they choose what they want to do with China. They ensure there's transparency on those agreements, where they take advantage of China's willingness to finance, but make sure that technologies and capabilities are also transferred. I think there was a risk, say, 10, 15 years ago, that countries thought, hey, China's willing to come, give us money, help us without any of those strings attached from the World Bank, etc. Let's take it. I think now people are having a much more sensible arrangement, recognizing that China is a partner, there's an export market, but actually it needs to be done in a more balanced way where governments in Africa are at the negotiating table in the driving seat, making choices that work for Africa rather than rolling over and say, I'll take any help I can get, even if it's Chinese. Because I think we've seen, say, with Djibouti and other places, there's a sting in the tail if you don't do it right. Um, but other countries have been much more successful because they're not in awe of China, but they see China as a potential partner and a contributor to their success. But they treat them carefully as well. So
Mm-hmm.
that I think is the trick, and then use that potential as a negotiating tool with respect to other partners who should not take the relationship with African countries for granted because China is a genuine alternative.
Yeah, 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 it is. So we have exactly 2 minutes now. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about Africa? Quickly, in 30 seconds.
Cautiously optimistic. I think there's a lot of things
Cautiously
that
optimistic.
it
Okay.
has potential for,
Yeah.
but I think and we talked about this earlier, the real issue is political settlements and getting elite bargains for growth sorted out. Because without that, the potential of the demographic dividend, the potential to sort of leapfrog technology um, won't get realized. And I think that's the key thing is there's huge potential, but there's a big downside risk of elites not allowing that to happen. I think that's where I would be looking. How do we create scenarios whereby the powerful elites in the different countries in Africa see the potential and are willing to make short-term sacrifices for everybody's long-term gain?
Awesome. Dr. Brien, thank you so much, sir. Wonderful to talk to you. Dr. Brien is a senior fellow at Future Africa Forum. He has advised governments in Africa over the years, and he is also an author as well. Awesome to talk to you, sir. Thank you so much for your insights.
My pleasure. Great to talk. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. Thank you all. We'll chat soon.